So the topic for today is the roles of community psychologists in bridging the divides in our nation. And we certainly have seen them, and everybody's talking about it. And it's an interesting question because I've worked with our guest tonight, this afternoon, Paula Green, for many years. And I realized we don't have that much going on in our own field on this topic. Paula was the founder of the Karuna Center for Peacebuilding and as a senior peacebuilding advisor to that center. She has extensive international experience in peacebuilding and conflict transformation. Think over the last 20, 30 years of every major conflict you could think of: Bosnia, Rwanda, Europe, Israel and the Palestinians. And Paula has been there bringing groups together to dialogue and increase understanding. I had the honor of being on her board at the Karuna Center, and she is both a good friend and a neighbor. She brings a sense of social responsibility and spiritual awareness to the work, and she's going to talk today about her work and the issue of peace building and bridging divides, both abroad and in the US. And then she's going to open it up to us for questions, but I also would like us to address whether this is something we would see as part of community psychology training and practice. And I know there's some who do it already, but I think that's an interesting question. So it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Paula.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I'm glad to meet all of you. This is a nice professional audience for me to be talking to. That's not often the case. And your profession very closely aligned with my own. Like many of you, I kind of bumped around in different fields of psychology and different professions. Basically, I should have studied social psychology. That's my interest. But what was available at the time was not that when I was doing my degrees. I got a master's from NYU at a place called the Center for Human Relations, which was really about intergroup relations in Greater New York in the 70s. So it was a very hot time, as it almost always is, in big cities. And I learned tremendous amount. And then I moved to New England and years later did a doctorate at BU in a kind of a counseling psychology degree. And I did private practice for a while, as Bill talked about, and I'm a refugee from that also. My heart was always in communities. It was always in the relationships across divides between people. And so I felt like in my earlier years, I was doing my livelihood, my psychology with part of my soul and doing my activism with the other part. And I wanted to bridge that divide inside myself and find a way to feel more whole in what I was doing. And I discovered this field of peace building, basically because my husband and I created a self-created sabbatical about 30 years ago. I went to India and the rest of South Asia and Southeast Asia for a year. And I started to see what people were doing by way of peace building in divided communities. And I thought, oh, that's where my heart is. That's really called me. So I came back and I took some various training programs to get myself geared up. And I started my own NGO, which is a crazy fool's errand, but it worked. And it's now 26 or 7 years old and still going. So that was quite positive. And I directed it for the first decade and a half or so. And while I was doing that, I was invited by a place called the School for International Training, which is a master's degree program in Vermont. It was originally the headquarters of the Peace Corps language training in the 60s. And then when that moved on to other places, it got turned over to a series of master's degrees. And I started a master's in peace and conflict, and then ran all kinds of seminars and workshops, intensives there. And through that and through Karuna Center, my work was quite international. And we were invited into war-torn and war-recovering countries in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Mideast. So I've been to an enormous number of places, and we tended to do long-term work. So I would commute to Bosnia and then commute to Sri Lanka, and then commute to Rwanda, et cetera, over the decades. And it was profound and hard and beautiful work. And I learned a tremendous amount about divides because I would often have people in the room from the two or more sides of a violent conflict. whose communities and sometimes family members had murdered each other and destroyed their own communities. So bringing those people into the room together was incredibly challenging. And I figured out, using dialogue and related techniques, how to make it work. And after the 2016 election, I was getting older anyway, and I thought, I have to bring this home. We are in such a mess here. The conflict is so terrifying. And I've seen in war zones what happens when the divides get impossible. Then you have armed conflict. We've had a little of that, but I mean organized armed conflict, armies against insurgents. And I wanted to do something. So Tom and I and other colleagues talked about putting a group together, and we assumed it would be here in Western Mass with those of us who were more progressive and people who were more conservative, and we couldn't find any partners. And that's not surprising, because right after 2016, people were very edgy, and most people thought that we liberals would just clobber them and make them feel bad. So they didn't want that, and they refused us. And I tried quite a bit in the area, and without success. And then through the internet, we met a wonderful guy named Fink, who was working in the coal mining area of Eastern Kentucky. He's not from there. He's from Hartford, Connecticut. He's another Yankee living person as we are. And he had a PhD in cultural studies. So he's very much not a Kentucky person, but he spent 5 years working there, and he partnered with us. And through that, we formed this organization, which we call Hands Across the Hills. And there's a very rich website that I would encourage you to go to, and you'll learn everything about it. We've had a more international publicity than this program deserves, because it's very small and very modest. But in a time of hopelessness in our own country, the press is interested in whatever they can find that's going to bring hope within the country. And so we were in the Times and the Globe and the New Yorker and Time Magazine and NPR, and a film was made about us by a German company, et cetera. So that's been remarkable, and it's all there for you to see. We've been meeting for 3 years. This year it's on Zoom. First 2 years, they came here twice and we went there once. One of the things I learned from my international work and my work at the School for International Training is that sufficient time is required for people to sink down into building trusting relationships. And there are a lot of dialogue programs in the US now. Most of them are half a day or a day. And for me, that's really insufficient and superficial and is not transformative. And I'm interested truly in transformation, the deeper transformation. I would have been happy to have a week or 2 weeks, but I knew I couldn't get that. So we settled on 3-day weekends. And that mattered because that was sufficient time. And I also set it up to have homestays, because being in someone's home is extremely intimate. And it's another way to bridge a divide. So the first time they came here, and I'll tell you why they made that choice, but they wanted to come here, and they did. And I matched them up. I had little bits of knowledge about each of them coming, and I did the best I could to match people up with a homestay host. And those have become some of the most solid relationships over the 3 years, because you're hanging out at somebody's kitchen table with their family in your bathrobe and sharing a bathroom, and you get to know each other. It's close. It can't be anything but close. You're on top of each other. And I also knew that we couldn't do dialogue all day because we would have too much brain drain. So, and also not everybody learns equally well verbally. That's a skill, and it's not everybody's skill. So we set it up to have cultural exchange. We had art and music and dance and theater and nature and potluck meals and all sorts of other avenues into opening the heart for us to get to know each other. And that menu of options also turned out to be, I think, a very deep part of our bonding. because people had ways they could feel safe. There was a lot of music. We had musical people on both sides of the divide, and that's a wonderful bonding. So there were music at meals and music in the evenings, and lots of camaraderie that way. They wanted to come here first because they didn't want us to go there first. And the backstory on that is that in the 60s and 70s, on the war on poverty that Johnson was running, reporters were coming in with their cameras, photographers, and people felt humiliated. They felt that they were being seen as stupid hillbillies, impoverished, dirty, stupid hillbillies, and the worst kinds of photographs were being taken, you know, from the most distraught family situations, the most damaged homes and environments, and splayed nationally. And they're carrying that humiliation now into the second and third generation, which is important learning for us. So they didn't know who we were, except we were a bunch of damn Yankees, and we were educated and privileged. So they wanted to come here first and test us out. And they did, and that was a wise decision on many levels. And then 6 months or 9 months later, we went there and they hosted us for 3 days. And then they came back here again the year later, and we were scheduled to go there this fall, but COVID put an end to it. And given the political climate, it's probably just as well that we weren't there because it's been so toxic this fall. So that's been the pattern of what we've done. Some of the people have dropped out. Our group has gotten smaller on the Kentucky end. It has never varied on the Massachusetts end. But some people have dropped out. So we have a smaller number of Kentuckians, but much more intense relationships. And there's a lot of back and forthing and mutual care. So it's as I said, a very tiny example of bridging divides, but it's had tremendous meaning in our lives and their lives, and to a larger extent than I would have thought possible, national life. I also was asked to co-start an interracial dialogue group, which, unlike Hands Across the Hills, does not want a lot of publicity. And so there's no stories about them, pictures and things of that sort. That's a local Western Massachusetts group. There are about half are people of color and half are white people. They good range in age, which I like, and professional and not professional, which I also like. We did some bonding with the South Carolina group. I wanted to continue the national exchange, and someone had a South Carolina connection. So we had a very good exchange. We went there and they came here, but given the context, our group wants to mostly focus on working locally, on reparations and police brutality and other local issues. So they're doing that. I also was asked to start another group that didn't last long enough. It was a Jewish-Muslim dialogue group. And that was around the conflict between those two communities. And it was wonderful, but there wasn't enough juice to keep it going for more than a year. So it dissipated. That was pretty much circumstantial, I think. So that's what I've been doing lately. And I still do some international consulting through Karuna Center. I still have a project with a former student with Israeli and Palestinian educators that I did last year and got canceled this year because of COVID, and they want to do it now virtually. And that's another place that's been close to my heart. So I'm happy to continue with that. Karuna Center had a project in Ethiopia this past year. And before COVID, I was in Ethiopia. It was wonderful. It's a combination of ethnic and religious, politically manipulated violence going on there, and a complicated situation. So that's a kind of overview of where my life has taken me, starting out in intergroup relations and doing the peace building on the side to now having them combined and feeling very connected to this work. And I don't like to give long talks. I like to have conversations. So I'd be happy if that would work for you to open this up for questions and comments and interactions.
People game for that? Before we start, let's just do a quick welcome to Tiffany and Jerry. Want to introduce yourselves, just name and where you're from? You're muted.
That might help. Hi, everyone. Good morning. This is my Saturday, actually, even though it's Friday. So it's why I'm not all, put together and everything. Hi, Paula. How are you? I appreciate you being here and holding space. I am Adler University and Community Wellness Institute and an alum of National Louis University's Community Psychology program. So a pleasure to meet you and thank you.
Thanks, and nice to meet you, Tiffany.
This is Jerry, actually.
Jerry.
Yeah, this is Jerry. I'm sure Tiffany will come up. Yep, pleasure.
I don't see any photographs, so I don't know who I'm talking
I know, that's okay. Right, yeah, that was me explaining, right? I just looked at the clock and said, it's 11 o'clock. I'm supposed to be somewhere here. So thankfully, Zoom is the space where we can just come as you are and mute our videos. Yeah, so yeah, pleasure to meet you again. And thank you.
Hi, Paula. This is Tiffany Jimenez. I'm also in Chicago with Jerry. I'm a professor at National Louis University and teaching in community psychology. We have a doctoral program here or there. So I'm not sure what else to say, but good to hear your story. Thank you.
Got a big Chicago contingent here. Someone's been doing recruiting.
It's a very strong program.
I'd like to start it off if I could.
Sure.
The wounds are fresh, and if you could maybe give some anecdotes about experiences you've had when people are just coming off a big change, a reconciliation started, but people are feeling very raw on both sides.
Yes, I'd be happy to.
It would help to have some, I mean, if we could root it in the U.S. political experience now, but if you could give us some ideas of where do you start at the very beginning?
I will talk about where I started overseas, and then I'll talk about where I started with Hands Across the Hills. It's a really good question, but I don't know who asked it.
Gloria Levin.
Okay, so I don't know your voices. I'm sorry. So there was a war in Bosnia from 1992 to 1995, and it was an ethnically mixed country that had been doing quite well for many years. And then its leader, Tito, died, and some fascist dictators came up and destroyed the country. And it was a bitter house-to-house, family split, community split. The splits were religious, national, ethnic. People there were of three religions. They were Muslim, they were Roman Catholic, and they were Eastern Orthodox, but they were not religious, and they were 1/3 intermarried. And they were so intermarried that nobody asked who your ancestors were when you got married, which is much more than the US has ever been able to accomplish. And they were very happy with that. And there were old churches and mosques there, but there wasn't much use for them. And these identities were provoked by fascist rulers who wanted power for themselves and wanted to take over everything. And the area that I was invited to work in was Northwest Bosnia, and it was completely destroyed. The first time I went there, the houses were crumbled and people were living in various kinds of camps. And the first workshop that I did was in a school, and they put us in the gym and the blood was still on the floor because it had been used as a concentration camp. So it was about as tough as it could be. And it was one of my first big international assignments. And the task was working with educators. The original task was working with women. The first impetus was a Muslim woman who called me. She didn't call me directly, but she knew about me. She didn't speak any English. I don't speak any Serbo-Croatian, so we had translators. And she asked if I would come and talk to the Muslim women and see if I could help them. deal with the aftermath of the war because they were all homeless. They had all had beautiful homes. It was a middle-class community, and a farming community was all destroyed, and they were living in destitution. And that's how we got started. And then they said to me, after we did this a couple of times, and it was not therapy, but it was very therapeutic. The first circle we had, they just went around the circle and cried and talked about their losses. And then we did some pulling together of what can we do in the community to help you that would also help other people. And that all worked out quite beautifully. And after a couple of times being there, they said, Paula, we want you to talk to the Serbs and bring the Serbs in. The Serbs were the enemy, the other side, in this particular part of Bosnia. And I said, why do you want to talk to the Serbs? And they said, because they used to be our husbands and wives and next door neighbors and colleagues and friends. And we've known them for generations. And then they killed us. But the country was divided militarily, armed by the United Nations, and they couldn't cross over into the Serb side. They could only stay on the Bosnian Muslim side. So they sent me to go across the border with my American passport and to find Serb women who would dare to cross this border with permission, of course, from the UN, and meet these people whose lives had been destroyed by their people. And I had 2 the first time and 4 the next time, and gradually it built. And the women began to bond, as women can do. They could cry together and mourn together and talk about their helplessness together. And they began to visit sites in the part where we could meet in, which was now the Bosnian Muslim part. And they bonded very beautifully. And then at some point I got my marching orders again, and they said, Paula, we think you should talk to the teachers because education is the key to the future of Bosnia. And if you can help the teachers, help the students the way you've helped us, maybe Bosnia has a future. So that escalated everything because I had to go to the ministries of education in these 2 entities, they were called, and get permission, which I did. And I began to work with educators. And again, we had to get permission for educators from one side, UN passes to cross for the day to see educators on the other side. And the first time we did it, we brought the Serb educators into the Bosnian Muslim side. They're now called Bosniaks. And the Muslim group was there sitting in a circle, waiting and waiting and waiting, because not so easy to cross an armed border, even with permission. And finally the Serbs came, and I just held my breath and I thought, I do not know what's going to happen in the next minute. I have no idea what's going to unfold. I was terrified. I took a breath, and they came in, and everybody stood up, and they went around the circle and shook hands with everybody. I almost cried. I thought, oh, we're going to be okay. This is what they did. Shaking hands is big in their culture. And they went around, they were all teachers. Turns out they had known each other before the war because they were all teachers in a larger city together. Half of them were pushed out, the other half were still there. So there were relationships. And we sat down and began. And I don't ever begin talking about the hardest stuff. I begin with trying to find common ground. And the common ground right then was, look around this circle. How does this feel? What are you experiencing right this minute in your hearts as you look around this circle? And of course the tears came, and that's good, that's healing. And the fears, the pleasure in being together, the fears, the shame, and we began to generate dialogue. And it built from there. That group was a 3-year group. I went 3 times a year to Bosnia for about 10 days each time. Workshops almost every day, as often as I could have them. And then we picked out the best of the group, and we trained them to carry on, because I don't ever like to leave a situation without people to pick up the pieces. And they did carry it on, and they're still doing it. And one of the young Bosnian Muslims young man who said, "I will never talk to a Serb." And his principal said, "I'd like you to go." And he came. And he's now running enormous peace camps for high school kids every summer, all the time, and running programs all year. He's got a peace farm and a peace camp, and he works with the religious leaders. So some of them have taken this on and carried it, which is quite gratifying. And I've been back to Bosnia 2 or 3 times over the years to do just individual pieces of work, one-time events for a week or something. I was there last year. It was quite moving for me. My heart's there a lot. When we started Hands Across the Hills, and these Kentuckians were coming to us in 2017, in the first year of Trump, amid all the horrid hostility that was developing, I had to figure out where to start with them. We were strangers to each other. And I started with families because it's something we have in common. And again, I didn't want to start with the conflict or the politics. I wanted to start with a place where we could build something and open our hearts. And so we used family stories, and it was more powerful than I ever might have imagined it would be because of the kinds of family stories on both sides of the divide that came out. And I had a 3-day window, and the drill. The first day you build a community, the third day you wrap it up and say goodbye. And so the second day was the time that I could allot to talking about the politics, and we did. And we got through all of that safely enough to be quite bonded by the end of 3 days. So that's an answer to your question, I hope, Gloria. Does that answer it?
I would like to know what you mean by family stories. I would imagine people telling terrible stories about how this has affected their family and having grievances against people that represent the groups that they're telling this to.
That's a very good question, and it didn't happen because I structured it in a different way. I asked a colleague to come in who's an artist to start us off because I wanted to start with something that was not verbal. And she beautifully brought in little squares of paper and lots of scissors and tape and glue and markers and things. And we asked each person to create on a square of paper a quilt square that would talk about their family. And I didn't say in which generation, but many people talked about parents and grandparents or even older generations. And it was social, pass me the crayon and can you help me with this glue? And people were not knowing each other, brand new to each other. We had just done a go round of names. We hardly knew each other, but we were a group working together, making this arts and crafts like children do. And it bonded us. And then this artist hung them up like a quilt. And there we were in the beginning coming together. So that turned out to be a very good way to start. And then we sat down in a circle, and I had already done things like guidelines for good communication and agreements, confidentiality and respectful speech and good listening and all of that. And I asked people to talk about what they had made and what it represented in their family. And it didn't work out, Gloria, to be antagonistic. It worked out to be very personal and very deep. And what happened on the Massachusetts side was that we had 2 women who were second generation Holocaust survivors. No, first generation, their parents were Europe. In one case, it was a woman whose parents were in Germany and got out in 1938. In one case, a woman whose mother was in France and got out very late there. And they told those stories with buckets full of tears. And that was wonderful for the group because it was so bonding and incredible for the Kentuckians who this guy Ben that I told you about before was the first Jew they had ever met. So our group members were the second Jews they had ever met. And they don't know Holocaust stories, and they don't know Holocaust history because it's not taught in the coal mining district of Kentucky in their schools. So there was tremendous empathy, an outpouring of empathy. So that again was also very bonding. And then there were other also important stories, but those were I think the most dramatic. And then on the Kentucky side, we heard stories that we Massachusetts people could never comprehend about fathers, brothers, husbands, sons, grandpas, all dying either in the mine or from black lung from the mine, and what that did to their families and the poverty and the struggle that they've had in their families. And they also cried. So it created an environment of trust and mutual care rather than an environment of toxicity.
Other people want to jump in? Or Gloria, you want to follow up?
Well, if no one else is going to, I have lots of questions.
Who's that? Gloria again?
Yeah.
Other people, anybody, wave your hand, flash a sign that you want to ask a question, make a comment.
My name should be circled in yellow, but
Anna.
So are there so that's the bonding experience, but at some point does it get down to talking about the conflicts between the groups that let's say certainly in a war environment, that's an easy thing to do, a little harder in terms of two different cultures that have never had, I mean, there's not open combat or something. But at some point, I'm sure that someone must, say something that is antagonistic, maybe not to a specific person, but to the group that they represent.
Yes, absolutely. Of course. And that's why we're there. We're not there to sing Kumbaya. We're there to talk about the difficult things in order to get through them, because we can't get through them unless we talk about them. In many of the places I've worked overseas, the typical question is, why did you start the war? Why didn't you stop the war? Why did you fight? Why did you allow your sons to fight and your husbands to fight if they were women? Why didn't you stand up? In Bosnia, when the war started in 1992, all the educators in this large city of Prijedor in northern Bosnia were called in by the superintendent of schools. And he said to them, all the Muslim teachers, stand up, gather your things, leave, and never come back again. Could you imagine yourself being in a room with hundreds of people, all your colleague, fellow educators, and half the group is told, stand up, walk out, and never come back to these schools again? And not one Serb stood up on their behalf. And they left, and their homes were blown up, and their families were killed, and they were exiled. And when I met with them 4 or 5 years later, that was one of the first things that came up. Why didn't you defend us?
Paula, the parallel question locally was, we held a meeting at the school, and it's a small town at 1,700. We had 300 people jammed into the gym. Luckily, the fire department didn't know. And we had questions. And one of the questions was parallel to the one Paula talked about. Why did you vote for Trump?
Yeah.
And you want to pick it up?
Yes, because that's the kind of question that doesn't get you any place, because what they're really saying is you're a bunch of idiots, to say the least, or fools, It's an accusation with a question mark at the end. It's not a question of curiosity. It's not a question of generosity. It's not a question that's going to lead to a real conversation. It's bam, bam, bam. Why did you do that, you dummies? And that's what they were afraid of. And that's what keeps coming up in every conflict. And so we try to reframe, and part of what I was doing with the Kentucky group, which I always do overseas also, is teach people what it means to ask a good question. What constitutes a good question? What constitutes a question that's going to give you an answer that's going to really be helpful, that's not going to be shameful? And of course, later we learned that shame and humiliation is carried by every one of these Kentuckians. So it makes it even harder to get a question like that, because it just rams in the shame and the feeling of inadequacy.
Right. And Gwen's response from Kentucky was very powerful. She said, you know, I was waiting to vote for a woman, and I was hoping I could do that. But when Hillary said, you know, I'm done with the coal industry in Kentucky, I had to look at the fact that coal had put shoes on my kids' feet and food on the table.
Yeah,
I'd lost a brother, 2 uncles, and I couldn't turn on my people. And, you know, we've all come to love Gwen deeply and dearly, but it was a very educational answer for all of us.
Absolutely.
Chris, you had a question. Do you want to pick it up?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thank you for your powerful stories, Paula. I really appreciate being able to participate in this. Gloria asked the question I was going to ask, like, how do you then get to sort of a place of addressing the conflict? And I think you've done a great job in answering that. My other question is more sort of about the history of peace building as you describe it. I come from a community where restorative justice and restorative practice is very prevalent in Waterloo region, as I mentioned earlier on, and often used in situations where somebody has been victimized through crime, where, you know, offender and victim come together to reestablish a relationship, or if the case, as the case may be, build a relationship of sorts where they can have mutual understanding. How are the roots of what you're doing related to that type of work, if at all? And do you see any sort of similarity? Where do you see sort of the differences, maybe, is what I want to know.
I think it's completely intertwined. You know, I mean, it's very much the same work. Part of peace building is dealing with truth and punishment and justice and reconciliation. I'm not using the word reconciliation in this context in the US because it feels premature by years to me. We don't even talk to each other. And that's the first step. The reconciliation is a bridge too far right now. And people think about the big TRC in South Africa and other major things. They don't realize that it's a multi-step program that takes a long time to accomplish. So even the word healing, I feel a little hesitant about. It feels now if we can bridge, then we begin. And I don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves. But when I'm teaching this work, which I do with graduate students, we always talk about getting to the issues of acknowledgement, apology, atonement, reconciliation, and forgiveness. But those are multi-stages, and each one is a precious thing on its own that takes time. But it's completely our work. And it's also completely the work that you all do, because it's community psych, social psych kind of work to do that. And what we're after is repairing communities deeply enough so that the narrative in that community changes from one of intolerance to one of acceptance. And that's a hard thing to change a narrative, but that's where we're going.
Thank you for that. If I could just maybe follow up, if you don't mind. One of the things that needs to be overcome when restorative justice practice happens is the tendency for humans to want to shame each other. Mm-hmm. It's such a powerful desire. to put down, to other, and to shame. How do you deal with that in peace building?
Well, it's a kind of aggression, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's really a way of attacking others. And we, again, when we're doing these dialogue groups, we have guidelines about how we speak to each other. So within the group, that doesn't happen unless people get agitated, and then we have to talk about it when it comes up. But what I always want to do is get down deeper. What's going on? What are the root causes here? And why are we shaming each other? What does it say about ourselves? If I shame you, what does it say about me and my own inadequacies and fears and anxieties? And can I talk about that instead of talking about you? Can I talk about me and try to get to the roots of what's happening in me that makes me lash out at you in aggression? So psychology again.
And a translation of that in terms of what we struggled with was when the lever group would get together, we always had to fight the impulse of, well, we're gonna show them they were wrong. They're gonna turn around and they're gonna, and it was always interesting how because that's shaming, and our hope was, well, it will be successful when they admit that they should have voted for Trump and now they're gonna vote for Trump. And that would be the question that people in town would ask us. Well, that's all sounds wonderful, Tom, but are they gonna change their vote? And one person wrote, we've had a lot of great writing, and go to the website, you'll see it, that, we learned to love each other without changing votes. It's just, that's not what it was about. And we were talking love at the end of the first meeting because it was so powerful. So, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Other questions from people? We got about 5 more minutes. Well, let me ask a question. Oh, go ahead, Tiffany, please.
Oh, so I was just thinking, you said you teach on this.
Mm-hmm.
What are you teaching about this? Like, you mentioned some tidbits, but I wonder, what are you referring to? What resources do you bring in? Well,
peace building has become a whole field. When I first got into it, no one could even spell it. And still doesn't pass spell check, but it's still there. But it's become a whole professional field, and I've got libraries of hundreds of books that are all about peace building, and all about the different forms of peace building. My interest is social psych, so it's interpersonal peace building. But there are other people who work on economic issues, political issues, military issues in peace building. There's many, many different things that people do. But I have always taught courses in dialogue as a tool in peace building. And I've also taught courses in reconciliation and forgiveness as tools in peace building, again, because that's my kind of area of interest. And I've also taught courses in conflict analysis, because we believe in this field that unless you understand the cause of the conflict, the deep cause of the conflict, you don't get to understand the dynamics that are happening between people. So we put a lot of time into conflict analysis. And now there are people doing brain science around this stuff. The whole epigenetics field of how is trauma carried to second and third generations, and what's the impact of that in communities and in preventing violence. That's one interesting piece. And I read a piece very recently by a colleague who's now got into brain science, and she's trying to look at changes in the brain chemistry around interaction with people across lines of divide. So there's even more that's going to be coming in future years, but there's plenty of education. And my students were getting a master's degree in peace and conflict. You can also get doctorates now in various places in the country in the field. So it's really growing, and it's so needed. And it's also growing internationally, because we don't want this just to be an American thing, but all over the world, there are programs in these fields now, which is very heartening, because we're going to have more violence as we have more climate catastrophe.
And it's an interesting issue, because we don't generally look at our communities at that level. I spent 20 years in a poor rural community, and we did all kinds of programs. You name the issue, we worked on it. But there was an incredible culture divide and economic divide in that community that we never put on the table that clearly. The longer we were there, it was the major thing that was going on. but we didn't have the tools and skills to do it. And it seems to me very appropriate for community psychology to be able to integrate some of this. So I love your question, Tiffany.
Yeah. It feels to me this is right up your alley in one way or another for all of you. I don't know what you'll do with this, but I hope it's been interesting for you.
A last question or two? Is Susan still here? No.
Comments, if not questions?
Yeah.
This is Gloria again. I'm sorry to be the big questioner here, but
someone's got to do it, Gloria.
But I have so many questions because we're going to be dealing with this for a long time.
You are.
So, like with the people in the Serbian situation, it seemed like they were moderates to begin with. But how do you handle staging in terms of eventually getting to those who are the real believers in a very aggressive way?
Fabulous question. You start with the ones who are willing to come, who are the moderates, who will show up, but they have husbands and wives and fathers and mothers and neighbors and colleagues and fellow citizens in their own community who are not moderate. And so my belief in this is we inoculate where we can those people who will come to the table and meet with us. And this is not something that stays in the circle. Please go back into your community, talk about this, show our pictures, tell our stories, share your feelings, take it back into the community so that the community begins to catch on to some of the potential for empathy for the other side. And there are always some people you will never reach. I mean, there were extreme extremists who are kind of outside the social norm that we don't have much hope of reaching because they're so psychologically damaged that they're stuck frozen where they are in their behaviors. But for many people, there's a real curiosity. And I think in this moment now with Biden in and with the evidence of the Capitol insurrection 2 weeks ago, I think there are more and more people curious about what can we build together. So it's a wonderful time for any of you in your communities to be thinking about this.
And we had an example, the person who stayed with us had a brother, and the brother was the leading Republican in town and on the fire department. And we ended up doing some wonderful things with him. We didn't convert him, but he certainly learned to appreciate all of us. It looks like there's another meeting coming in, so we're going to get out. I want to thank Paula enormously for this, and